Okay, awesome. So yeah, let's get going in earnest. Um, Thanks to everybody who's joining. Really appreciate it. We've got a bunch of people who registered but aren't able to join the webinar. So we're going to be recording this today and send that out to all of you and everybody who registered. So just a little bit of housekeeping, some introductions. My name is Aubrey. I'm the staff attorney and federal policy director with Wild Montana, and I'm based in Butte. And we have some awesome folks from the East Coast who are going to be discussing federal budget reconciliation and what it means for public lands. As everybody has joined, like I said, you're on mute. Please keep yourself on mute throughout the discussion, just so we don't get any background interference that disrupts the discussion or the recording. This is a discussion with our panelists. So as we go, if you have questions, please feel free to drop them in chat if you're able to. If you can direct message those to either me or Zach Angstead, that'll help prevent them getting too lost. So let's jump right into it. Our panelists today, we have Justin, Kyle, and Sarah. Justin Muse is the Government Relations Director with the Wilderness Society based in DC. Kyle Jones is a Director of Federal Affairs for the Center of Campaigns and Organizing at the Natural Resources Defense Council, also based in Washington, D.C. And finally, we have Sarah Kendall, the Program Director at the Western Organization of Resource Councils based in Washington, D.C. I'll keep track of things in the background, and Zach is also moderating today, and Zach is Wild Montana's Federal Legislative Director. So we've got a lot to talk about. I think some stuff even happened late last night when it comes to budget reconciliation. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Zach and our panelists.
Thanks, Aubrey. Yeah, as Aubrey said, my name is Zach Angstead, Federal Legislative Director for Wild Montana. Yeah, so first question, I think this will go to you, Kyle. We're here to talk about budget reconciliation, which is probably the most confusing thing I've ever heard of, to be honest. But could you give us a brief description of what is budget reconciliation and how does it differ from the normal legislative process?
Funny you should ask that. Oh, the whole PowerPoint, just in case that question was asked. I'm going to awkwardly share my screen right now and make that happen for you. Here we go. I think it worked. So, for those of you who don't know me, yeah, I'm Kyle Jones, Director of Federal Affairs at NRDC. But also, before I came to NRDC, for the better part of a decade, I was House Parliamentarian for the U.S. House of Representatives. So, the budget reconciliation process is something I've gone through a few times and have explained to people in many different settings for many different purposes. So I'm happy to do it here. I will caution you all, this is going to be wonky. It verges on the boring, but I'm going to make it as unboring and unwonky as possible. I'm going to keep it pretty high level, and if folks have questions, they want to dig into stuff, I'm happy to dig in. But to the extent we can get through the presentation before you have questions on the procedure part, that'd probably be best just in case I answer your stuff later on. So let's talk about budget reconciliation. What is a budget reconciliation bill? Well, the reconciliation process was created in the Congressional Budget Act of 1974. That act was the last time that the federal government's manner of funding itself and budgeting for itself was reformed in a substantial way. And reconciliation bills in particular were added to that process as a tool for Congress to quickly enact laws that could bring revenue and spending into conformity with the annual budget resolution. Well, what's a budget resolution? Every year, Congress is supposed to pass a concurrent resolution on the budget, and this sets spending levels for the federal government and informs the annual appropriations process. A concurrent resolution is simply passed by the House and the Senate. It doesn't need to be signed by the president, so it's not a law, but it sets spending levels that the House and Senate can enforce upon themselves as they come up with their annual spending bills. So the budget committees on both sides will come up with top-line spending targets, which then are distributed across various areas of the government. And as they're formulating their annual spending bills, they have to stay within those spending limits and so forth. They aren't law, as I said, but they're enforceable within the House and Senate by points of order and so forth as they compose the appropriations process. Now, the reconciliation process is optional. It can, but does not have to be a part of the budget resolution. The theoretical purpose of it is to facilitate the spending plan that Congress sets out in its budget resolution. What does it look like? If Congress decides to embark on a reconciliation process, it will include in its annual budget resolution reconciliation instructions to various committees of jurisdiction. So you'll have a title in the budget resolution that says, hey, Committee X, you're instructed to reduce the deficit by $100 million. Committee Y, you can increase it by 50 million. Committee Z, reduce it by this much. And the idea is to sort of bring spending in line with what they would like as they put out their budget resolution. So these are the steps. First, you have to adopt that budget resolution in both houses. Now, this is something that just happened here in Washington, D.C. before the Congress went out on its present recess. And you have to have reconciliation instructions in that resolution. Then, once you have that resolution adopted, committees that were given instructions, reconciliation instructions in that resolution, generate bill text within their jurisdictions, and they mark them up, which they then transmit to the budget committee in each chamber. Those committees assemble the product, and eventually it's voted on the floor in the House and the Senate. Now, like I said, it began, or at least it was conceived of, as a mechanism for Congress to quickly balance the federal government's books as it comes up with the New Year's budget. But it now is used in a more politicized manner. Why? Well, it's appealing because it limits debate time in the Senate. Usually, when you're considering a bill in the United States Senate, in order to cut off debate and get to a vote on the bill itself, you need to invoke cloture before you can go to the motion to proceed on a bill. And cloture requires a 3/5 majority, what people often term the 60 vote threshold, before you can actually get to a passage vote. So unless you have a bill that has the buy-in of 60 senators, for the most part, it's never going to see floor time. Reconciliation bills are an exception to this rule. All you need is a simple majority because there's no debate that needs a cloture motion to cut it off. So the shorthand way of thinking of that is you don't need 60 senators, you need 51. Thus, it's become an attractive tool to move bills that are only supported by narrow majorities. That said, you can't just put the whole world into a reconciliation bill. There are restrictions on what can be included. What are those restrictions? Well, things that are allowed are things that change the government's revenues or its outlays, i.e. what it's spending, or the terms and conditions under which spending is done or revenues are collected. So a per se thing that's okay to do in a reconciliation bill is adjusting a tax, something along those lines, or fiddling with some sort of a spending program, for example. Things that are not allowed in reconciliation bills are, of course, things that don't change outlays or revenues or the terms and conditions under which they're collected. You can't have provisions in a reconciliation bill that would cause a committee that was named in the budget resolution as having reconciliation instructions to violate those instructions. You can't do anything that's outside the jurisdiction of the committees that were instructed in the budget resolution. You can't change outlays or revenues in a manner that's merely incidental to the non-budgetary components of a provision. That one is sort of the key one. So you can do something that technically has a revenue impact, but has a much bigger policy impact. And that's not okay. That violates what is known as the Burr rule, which I'll talk about in a second. You also cannot increase the deficit in a reconciliation bill beyond the budget window covered by the bill in question. Now, that budget window can be no longer than 11 years, but for various scoring reasons, it's usually in the 8-year time frame. So that is why you're hearing a lot of talk about the Trump 2017 tax cuts expiring this year. When those were enacted in 2017, of course, because they're tax cuts, so they increased the deficit. So they had to sunset those tax cuts after the term of that budget resolution, which was 8 years, which is why they're talking about continuing them this time around. But yes, you can't do something that increases the deficit beyond that window. You also can't touch provisions that change Social Security in a budget reconciliation bill. So what happens if you write a reconciliation bill that has subject matter that's not allowed? Well, if it's not removed before it gets to the Senate floor, it can be taken out on the second Senate floor via what's known as a point of order. In other words, a senator on the floor seeks recognition from the chair and says, I make a point of order against Section 302. Its budgetary impacts are merely incidental to its policy impacts. And the chair will rule, and the chair does follow precedent, at least the chair has to date. And something that violates what is known as the Byrd Rule is stricken from the bill at that point on the Senate floor. Also, if you have a bill that has a high enough quantum, like enough material that doesn't qualify for reconciliation, it won't attain privilege in the Senate at all, and it will never make it to the floor. So it is important that, whoever is generating this bill follows these rules. So you can't do anything to get around the filibuster in the Senate, is the bottom line. What are the key inflection points for the purposes of people who want to advocate around a particular reconciliation bill? Well, first up is the step that we just passed. That was the concurrent resolution on the budget. That's the measure I mentioned that must be passed by both houses, contains reconciliation instructions. And for that measure to become law, it needs to be subjected to what is called a vote-a-rama in the Senate. It is an opportunity where senators can offer an indefinite number of amendments on a variety of subject matters and force votes on them. We've gone through 2 different vote-a-ramas because there have been multiple attempts to pass a concurrent resolution on the budget. They finally were successful 2 weeks ago, but that's the first inflection point. So what do we have coming up? Starting in the next 2 weeks, you have the committee process. Committees that were instructed in the concurrent resolution on the budget can produce texts, and then they can mark them up. During these markups, amendments are offered and voted on in that setting. So we will see in 2 weeks' time, we expect the House Committee on Natural Resources, which is going to be the committee with jurisdiction over most of what the group here on this call care about. They're going to release their text 24 hours in advance of their markup, and then it's going to come to the committee, and members are going to debate it, offer a slew of amendments. That markup could last 24 hours or more. And that's an inflection point where, lobbyists like myself, like Justin, are going to weigh in with the committee after we've reviewed the text and say, hey, offer this amendment to make this point, or offer this amendment to try and fix this provision. After the committees presumably successfully report their measures, they go to the budget committee, which takes all of the different committee products, puts them together into one big bill. The budget committee is forbidden by law to change the actual text of the reconciliation bill, but in that budget committee markup, you can offer non-binding motions that instruct, ask the committee to instruct the House or the Senate on how they should proceed on the measure, what amendments they should make in order. So it's another opportunity to provide, messaging, get messaging out there, and force votes on those messages. So that's something that folks like the lobbyists on this call will also engage with. In the House, then, the Rules Committee gets the text from the Budget Committee and then can revise it. Usually what the Rules Committee does at this stage is it takes whatever monstrous text, when I say monstrous, I just mean purely in size terms, takes that text, reviews it for obvious Byrd Rule violations, and strips those out so you don't risk privilege in the Senate, like I talked about earlier. It also tries to identify politically problematic provisions that could jeopardize the measure from being able to pass on the House floor, and it'll take those out as well before it then sets the term for debate in the House. The Rules Committee can entertain amendments and decide to make them in order for consideration on the floor. This almost never happens in a partisan setting like this because those amendments can really screw up the whip count on the final vote. So you will probably see, for the bill that's currently pending, no amendments made in order in the House and just several hours of debate followed by an up or down vote. In the Senate, however, the Budget Act provides the terms for debate. So that's 20 hours equally divided, which is an advantage over the normal Senate rules where debate can carry on forever unless you can successfully invoke cloture with 60 votes. But this caps debate at 20 hours and it allows for infinite amendments. That's the vote-a-rama. Once you hit the 20-hour debate cap, there's no more debate, but you can keep offering amendments that get up or down votes. The lobbyists on this call will be submitting amendments. In some cases, already have submitted amendments to highlight certain issues in that setting and force senators to either take tough votes or maybe even try to perfect the measure in some way, shape, or form. That also is the inflection point at which, Byrd Rule points of order can be made, like I talked about earlier. And those of us with some procedural acumen, like myself, we'll offer arguments to folks in the Senate as to which provisions we think should be birded out, and ask them to make those points of order on our behalf. And then finally, you'll often end up with dueling versions of a text between the House and Senate. They, of course, need to come to agreement on a single text and pass that text through both houses before the president can sign it into law. There are multiple ways to do that. You can ping amendments back and forth between the houses. You can go to conference on a measure where each body sends a select few members to hammer out an agreement behind closed doors, known as a conference report, which both houses then can vote on. And that becomes the final measure that goes to the president. So, just to tease where this discussion is leading, what's in play in the present reconciliation bill? The House Committee on Natural Resources and the Senate Committee on Energy and Natural Resources both were instructed to reduce the deficit by not less than $1 billion. This puts into play a number of issues that people in this space will care about. Mandatory oil and gas leasing would be one, subject in those committees' jurisdiction that theoretically at least could raise revenue and put them in compliance with their reconciliation instruction. Public land sales, the selling off of public lands, would be another thing that would, qualify for reconciliation, and could allow them to hit their target. Something else that's in their jurisdiction that also has been raised as a potential target in this bill are the oil and gas fiscal reforms that were enacted in the Inflation Reduction Act, which itself was a reconciliation bill. Eliminating those reforms would cost money. So hopefully that makes them less appealing for those who are supporting, those who supported those reforms, like NRDC. However, if they go after them, that means they're going to have to sell more. There'll have to be more lease sales. There'll have to be more public land sales. So it could be a real double-edged sword for us there. So these are the things that are in play. I'm going to allow my colleagues to sort of delve into those in more depth. But that is the process. And I will stop sharing at this point. If anyone has any process-centric questions, I'm happy to field those now. Questions on the subject, on the substance of what we'd be looking at, probably can wait until my colleagues have had a chance to address that. Also, I hope I did not bore everyone to death. And seriously, there are no bad questions here. I've gotten the most basic questions from high-level leadership staff on the House and Senate over the course of my career. Any any clarifying question, there's no bad question. I'm happy to answer it. Sounds like you can really gum up the works in this process. Yes, Sally. Yes, you can. The most obvious inflection point for gumming up the works is the vote-a-rama in the Senate, right? Of course, you can always try to offer amendments to try and perfect a bill or remove something that you don't like from the bill. The problem with just doing that, however, is usually senators are instructed by their leadership, even if you like an amendment that you see, don't vote for it. A, because this has been a carefully negotiated agreement that could cause it to fall apart either on our floor or on the House floor. So whether you like an amendment or not, don't you dare vote for it or we'll come down on you hard. So while we can put forward amendments to perfect the bill in good faith, we can not always expect them to be reviewed conscientiously or voted on, in an honest, plain dealing way. And that has been true of both parties who've brought reconciliation bills to the floor, to be clear. So if those sorts of amendments are not in play, you then also want to put on another hat and think, okay, what issues can we put on the floor here for votes that are going to make people feel real bad about voting against them? And that is something that we also do. As I said, in that inflection point in the Senate, we also look at every provision in the measure and we will consider what bird arguments can be made against them so that they can be taken out, i.e. do they qualify to be in a reconciliation measure? And we are hearing out in the ether that there are a lot of provisions that would not qualify. Bypassing certain permitting requirements, for example, very difficult to do in the reconciliation context. And there are many of us here in the lobbying world who already are formulating arguments against attempts to do something like that without even seeing what those attempts would look like, just sort of anticipating them. You can arm your, chance with talking points about why something is important, draw out debate time, also raise things back into people's districts. Public land sales in particular obviously have a very discrete, localized impact. A member from a district that's affected by something like that, from a state that's particularly affected, people who are aggrieved by those proposed land sales should let their folks know it. That's how democracy works, right? And there are other procedural tricks that I'm working on that I will hold in my back pocket right now, just in case we get to a point where they will be useful to surprise people with. But yes, the they do exist, and that's very astute observation, Sally. And yeah, that's Justin. You answered Tom's question. That is the CBO provides the analysis of savings or costs, but of course not. That's not the entire analysis. You have a Senate parliamentarian then who weighs, even if something costs money or makes money, you have to look at the policy impact of that. So say you had a permitting provision that was some sort of pay to play type deal. You pay $10,000, you can skirt, permitting requirement X. Well, sure, that's going to probably raise some money, but what you're doing in the process is setting aside an array of laws that were enacted by Congress to stop exactly the thing you're sort of raising money to try and enforce. So I would imagine that in most instances, something like that would be viewed as having a greater policy implication than the revenue implication. But CBO does inform the revenue side of all those questions, for sure.
Thanks, Kyle. I still don't think I understand it, but maybe a little bit better.
A little bit.
So if anyone else has further questions, feel free to drop them in the chat and we'll kind of try and round them out at the end. But we're going to move on to our next question. And Kyle touched on this, but what might we see in the 2025 reconciliation bill on public lands? And Sarah, if it's okay, I think we'll start with you about what we might see.
Yeah, I think Kyle really kind of set this up and in some ways answered your question. But if you sort of think through all of the stages, my approach to advocacy, especially for folks who are not in DC lobbying in the halls of Congress every day, is to really sort of think about like less the procedural steps and more how do we create the controversy, pushback, opposition in an effective way. And so I think where I would start is as soon as bills are introduced and the text sees the light of day, like that is kind of a critical moment for there to be the public weighing in a very clear way about provisions that are unpopular, controversial, would have negative impacts. And that is, with this legislation, that's going to be extremely broad. We're expecting a series, like each committee will have their own bill. And with public lands, it's really going to be very focused on the House Natural Resources Committee. So I think we're anticipating Congress comes back next week, that they are aiming to release bills quickly. Like sometimes those processes get bogged down and slowed. That's often a good sign from our perspective when they have provisions that we think are a very bad idea that are included. And so I think I would maybe just kind of kick things off with saying, like, as soon as the text is out is kind of like a very important moment to disrupt the momentum as much as possible. But then maybe, Justin, do you want to kind of take it from there on other procedural opportunities?
Sure. Yeah, I'm more than happy to. Hello, everybody. Justin Muse from the Wilderness Society, also based in DC. Just in terms of process, we are hearing that we could see text of the reconciliation bill that will be before the House Natural Resources Committee as early as next Thursday, May 1st. That will allow for 3 business days before the markup takes place in that committee, where members of the House Natural Resources Committee can kind of line by line go through that bill and offer amendments to it, to strike out the provisions that we oppose and to add in provisions that we may support. So that's a really important accountability point, and just more than anything wanted to flag that May 1st date is when we're likely to finally see what's going to be in this reconciliation bill. And I know, at some point soon, we'll go through some of the things that we think will be in the reconciliation bill. But before we do that, I'm going to post in the chat a document that's been guiding a lot of our advocacy. It's a list of pay-fors, provisions that Republicans announced back in January that they were looking into to raise money committee by committee. A lot of the lands, federal lands provisions that we all work on most closely are in the House Natural Resources piece of that document, so would direct your attention there. But I'll pause there and maybe we can go into the specifics of the bill.
Thanks, Justin. I appreciate that. And thank you for posting that. Sarah, I think we'll start with you on what we might see in the 2025 reconciliation bill for public lands. If you want to talk about some of the possibilities we're potentially going to see around coal, that'd be wonderful.
Yes, and as I do this, I will just point out that, as Kyle clearly explained, like we're looking for provisions that have to basically increase or decrease federal revenue here. At a very high level, the leadership need to find things that will pay for the tax breaks and other things they want to do. And one of the kind of points of tension here is that a lot of the things we're talking about would potentially decrease revenue. And so I just wanted to add that to kind of the larger backdrop, although I think many folks are already aware of that. And there are a number of different things that could be done. Like I'm going to start off talking about coal and then hand it off to Justin, I think, who will cover oil and gas, and then talk about public lands more broadly. But I think when it comes to coal, there are a number of things that could be done to try to spur coal leasing and mining. And I think there are sort of like three different categories that we think of as being most in play that have most been talked about. I think to start off, many folks on this call are aware that the Biden administration ended the leasing of federal coal within the field areas for the Bureau of Land Management's Miles City, Montana, and Buffalo, Wyoming field office. These encompass the Powder River Basin, which is the most prolific coal basin in the United States. Nearly half of the coal mined in the US is mined out of that region. And the vast majority of that coal is federal. More than 85% of all federal coal that is mined comes from that region. So this was a very significant action. Side note, the mines in this region still have significant coal that's already under lease, so they will not be shutting down immediately, but the leasing pause has been a major target for the Montana and Wyoming delegations and the Trump administration. And so it is possible that they will try to craft some kind of coal leasing requirement that would reverse that decision to end leasing. So that's one, definitely possibility where they would try to set up some sort of mandate for coal leasing. I think another possibility that would be revenue-based would be to look at the federal fees and royalties connected to federal coal leasing and mining. One of the things that has been mentioned in various White House, and I think especially the Interior Secretary's, priorities, just various documents that have been released, is looking at reducing coal royalty rates. And so that's another area they could target. And then I think thirdly, and actually I should say on that, but there also are things like bonus bids and other, various other fees that are associated with coal leasing. And so that's another area that we could see targeted. And I think thirdly, the area that we're also carefully watching for is any kind of federal minerals giveaways. And one, I know we have a lot of folks today from Montana where there's Senator Daines has a kind of high profile bill that would initiate a three-way land and mineral swap between the Signal Peak mine in Montana's Bull Mountains, a wealthy private family, and the Crow tribe. And so there's revenue from royalties and other things that are kind of at play here. So that's something else that they could be potentially looking at. And it would privatize federal coal and public lands and then strip the royalty revenue from both federal, state, and county governments. So those are kind of three different buckets of changes that we're looking at on the coal front. And there you'll see a lot of parallels to oil and gas, I think. And Justin, I will hand it over to you to cover that.
Excellent. Thank you for that, Sarah. So on oil and gas, there are a number of different possibilities that we've heard could be included in reconciliation, both directly from House Natural Resources Chairman Bruce Westerman, Chairman Mike Lee of the Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee, and others who've commented on the reconciliation process. First and foremost, and Kyle included this in his slide, but we're expecting to see language that would mandate quarterly onshore oil and gas lease sales across the western states, including Montana. This language was included in the House Republican energy bill last Congress, the Lower Energy Costs Act. And specifically what that legislation did is it not only mandated quarterly lease sales, but it also prohibited the Department of the Interior from canceling lease sales due to lack of interest or deferring parcels, delaying lease sales. By mandating that, when there are deferrals, the DOI must then schedule a replacement sale. So it essentially ties the department's hands to conduct these lease sales on a regular basis, taking away the secretary's authority to lease or to not lease. So that's one thing we expect to see. We have gotten some concerning. We have also heard that there is legislation that was offered by Senator Daines that kind of builds on that Republican bill from last year by requiring that all eligible parcels of federal public lands be offered as part of those onshore quarterly lease sales. In the most egregious scenario, that could result in, as many as 200 million acres of public lands being offered for oil and gas lease sales on a quarterly basis. And obviously that makes us very concerned. So that's one possibility. Another possibility that we could see is a repeal of the onshore oil and gas lease sales that were included in the Inflation Reduction Act. Folks who remember that bill in 2022 will remember there was a really important set of provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act that were kind of long fought, long overdue reforms to the onshore oil and gas leasing process. Specifically, what the IRA did is it raised the federal royalty rate for producing oil and gas on federal public lands from 12.5% to 16.67%, just to bring that royalty rate in line with the lowest state rate, which is Wyoming's, also 16.67%. Another was increasing the minimum per acre bid on federal public lands from $2 per acre, which was set in 1987, never adjusted for inflation, brought that up to $10 per acre, and also included an increase of rents, which had also been set more than 30 years ago, never adjusted for inflation. Rents are the price that companies pay once they secure a federal oil and gas lease to reserve their right to develop before they start producing payable quantities of royalty revenue. It also included a fee on expressions of interest, so a $5 per acre fee to nominate federal public lands for lease. Prior to the Inflation Reduction Act, that was $0. It was completely free to nominate a federal parcel for oil and gas leasing. And the IRA also ended non-competitive leasing, where federal parcels that are not bid on in an auction can be leased for kind of a sub-market rate of $1.50 per acre, which is extremely low, less than a cup of coffee, as many of you may have heard around that time. So what reconciliation giveth, reconciliation can taketh away. So because those accomplishments were done via reconciliation back in 2022, they can easily be wiped out through this process again. And we're hearing that that's likely. So that's another thing to be on the lookout for, and another thing that gives us great concern. So some other things that we'll likely see in the Republican reconciliation bill include the sale of federal public lands. That document that I shared in the chat that lists the pay-fors that Republicans are looking at includes includes a line item for sale of federal lands. It doesn't include a cost or revenue amount to it, but we have heard several senators and representatives talk about the possibility and utility of selling off federal public lands to raise revenue. Chairman Bruce Westerman has talked about this. Senator John Hoeven from North Dakota, Mike Lee have both talked about this as a way to raise federal revenue. They've really couched their descriptions and public comments on this around kind of taking a scalpel as opposed to a machete. But we're still very concerned about any sell-off of federal public lands, especially without the public really having a chance to see what they're talking about. We'll have 3 days between the release of the bill text and a committee vote, so that gives us great concern as well. And then I'll just flag a couple of other quick things that we're also expecting. Mandatory oil and gas lease sales in specific locations like the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, various offshore parcels, greater oil and gas lease sales in offshore tracts in the Gulf of Mexico and the Cook Inlet in Alaska. And there also may be additional place-based oil and gas provisions. One that's mentioned in the document that I shared is an adjustment of the buffer zone around the Chaco Canyon historical site in New Mexico. Currently, there's a buffer where drilling and leasing cannot take place within a certain buffer zone. They may reduce the size of that buffer zone to allow more oil and gas leasing to take place, which would have a revenue effect. So that's what we're expecting. It's a lot of really bad stuff, but it'll be really important for us to do everything we can to get congressional offices to take every opportunity at their disposal, whether it's in committee, on the Senate floor, to draw attention to these bad provisions and force votes on them.
Thanks, Justin. I'm trying not to be doom and gloomy now, but I appreciate that. Real quick, I know we're running out of time here quickly, and we still have a few questions to get to and some questions from the participants, but would you all take roughly 2.5 minutes to talk about the amendment process and some things that we're thinking that could potentially be beneficial without giving anything away that might be in our back pockets? Kyle, we can start with you if that's all right.
Look, a good place to start is always, it's something that's always in order and reconciliation, is striking language that you don't like, particularly when you know that you have bipartisan opposition to that language. So the question was raised in the chat whether the Hickenlooper vote, when it came to public land sales, the utility of it. And yeah, it's a good question. Would Daines and Sheehy have voted for that amendment if they had, if they weren't certain that it would fail? Because if they had amended the resolution successfully, it would have caused a real, hubbub with their leadership. So were they only voting that way because they knew it was a vote they could toss away? It's a great question. But nonetheless, you can point to that now, or we, advocates can point to that and say, there's bipartisan opposition to this principle. And there is utility in that as they're formulating the bill and as they're debating it on the floor and they're debating it in committee. Like I said, there's going to be a general instruction to vote against anything that is put forward on this bill, whether you agree with it or not, under pain of not literally death, but political death. So trying to find the issues that unite the opposition party and peel away a few members of the majority party on a bill like this, that's the gold standard. I do think particular public land sales might be able to generate that kind of pushback or create the specter of political pressure. That my hope is that I don't think we'll get to a stage where something is in the bill when it hits the floor and it'll get peeled away. At that point, you're trying to create tough votes for people and make them feel pain. But if you see something in the bills that are initially released, as I said, that bill is going to get pared down greatly by the Rules Committee, and so forth, before it actually makes its way to the floor. if you can signal to leadership that something is going to create them political problems if it remains in the bill, then something will be stripped away behind the scenes. So, having a bipartisan vote on record against something lowers the chances of it making it into a final text. So I would say that. And then otherwise, I'm focused on bird rule, material to target provisions that already are in the bill and have them stripped out. That's my thought. I don't know if other folks have mandatory thoughts.
Yeah, Sarah, any thoughts?
That I would add a lot, maybe just to underscore what Kyle said about forcing people to go on the record on individual provisions, especially things that are deeply unpopular, including public lands protections, I think is something important that we are definitely thinking about.
Yeah, Justin, any thoughts from you?
No, I think that, well, yes, I think that was a great summary from Kyle, and good thoughts from Sarah too. I would just add, messaging is really important with these amendments too, especially on the oil and gas work, which I know the three of us work on really closely. For instance, like cutting royalty rates may sound like a really attractive idea to a lot of folks who are really into the energy dominance agenda. But one thing that we're working on with committee staff is just making clear how that would touch down in communities. You hear often about how communities rely on oil and gas revenue to fund social services, and if you're cutting those rates and cutting those state shares of minimum bids, rents, et cetera, that's going to have real implications on the ground in communities across the West. So that's just an anecdote of some of the kind of specific messaging that we're trying to do around these amendments to really make these votes as uncomfortable as possible.
Thanks.
I just
Oh,
chime
go
in
ahead.
really quickly on a question in the chat that is related to this. Obviously, to come up with proper amendatory ideas, we do need to see the text so we know what we're amending. And Sally asks in the chat, how do we sign up to get the bill text as soon as it's released? I'm sure if you're on listservs of the type that got you on this call, they'll be circulated pretty soon after they are released. But if you want to really play some inside baseball, Sally, that's the link to the House Committee document repository. And so, as Justin says, it looks like the latest is May 6th on the Natural Resources Committee markup. That's going to be the first we see text that touches these issues. 24 hours in advance of that, on May the 5th, they are required to release the text so that members have a chance to have a day with it before the markup begins. So if you go to that link and you refresh it and wait for the Natural Resources Committee notice to pop up, they are required to put the text up there. So you can get it there. It is not the easiest website to navigate, but you'll get it even before you see it on the listservs if you go there.
Thanks, Kyle. Sarah asked a question, but we're going to try and tackle that one at the end real quick because we have a few more questions that we're going to try and get through. Justin, would you take just a few minutes to discuss prior reconciliation efforts, particularly in 2017 and 2022?
Yeah, absolutely, Zach. Thanks for the question. And I touched on this a little bit in my framing around what we're expecting to see in this upcoming reconciliation bill, which is kind of an undoing of a lot of what happened in 2022. But yeah, so the Inflation Reduction Act included the oil and gas reforms that I mentioned. It also included some pretty historic investments in climate programs. And one thing that I neglected to note in my summary of what we're expecting to see is, quite a few rescissions of those specific investments from the Inflation Reduction Act that went into Department of the Interior programs like resilience and national parks funding. So, those are things that could be part of reconciliation too. But yeah, the 2022 bill was by and large an investment in agencies and in the NEPA process to help facilitate the responsible permitting of energy projects as well. Going back to 2017, that is the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. Folks will remember this as the big, HR1 top priority of the 115th Congress during President Trump's first term. The first 2 years of his first term. This legislation, by and large, was 10-year tax cuts kind of across the board, but it also included some lands provisions, and most notably, it included a provision that opened up the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge in northeastern Alaska for oil and gas leasing. So not only did it open up the Arctic Refuge for leasing, but it also mandated that 2 lease sales occur in the Arctic Refuge between the enactment of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which happened in December 2017, and January 1st, 2025. So that's an example of the kinds of things that we've seen through reconciliation. One note about the Inflation Reduction Act is, folks who are following the oil and gas reform effort will recall that there were efforts to go even further than, what ended up being in the Inflation Reduction Act. I mentioned the royalty increase, the fiscal terms increase, the prohibition on non-competitive leasing, but during that effort, there was also an effort to increase federal bonding for mitigating onshore oil and gas wells that are orphaned or abandoned by increasing the bonding rates that companies have to pay kind of on the front end before they drill to cover the costs of mitigation on the back end. You'd think that this would be something that would have a budgetary impact that would save the federal government money, but right at the 1 yard line, the Senate parliamentarian decided that it was not budgetary in nature, and it ended up being stripped out of the Inflation Reduction Act really at the 1 yard line because of that. So that just goes to show that not everything that navigates the House side, the Senate side ends up in the final bill. There can be these kind of last minute bird rule kind of excisions, I would say. But yeah, that's just kind of a flavor of what we've seen in the past 2 reconciliation bills.
Thanks, Justin. Running short on time, but sorry, Kyle, did you have something to add real quick?
Oh, I've been combing through the chat and answering as many of the written questions as I can, but there's one on timber sales and one on complicating of leasing via the sale of public lands. I do think, Laura, that would complicate things. I don't know if that's an argument that you feel would avail you with folks. That's one that certainly you could make. I'm not totally sure about the timber sales aspect. I don't know if any of my colleagues have any thoughts on that. That one I couldn't come up with a good answer on. That's I'll have to leave that one as an open question, I think, because I don't know too much about the functioning of timber sales. How much of that goes into the federal fisc? I don't know. That would be the question. If I were still parliamentarian, what I would ask when asked about timber sales is, what is the direct impact on revenues from these timber sales? And what environmental laws are being waived to facilitate them? What other processes are being circumvented if you're trying to conduct a direct timber sale in a reconciliation bill? And I would want to see a CBO score. So I don't know what the answer to those questions are, but those are the questions that I would be asking and I would want an answer to. I can say that.
Yeah, thanks for that, Kyle. I think you all have covered some really great topics and have increased my existential dread. So congratulations. Not really, but so I think there are opportunities in the next, we'll say, month-ish to influence our delegation as Montanans. And this is open for any of you, what are the best inflection points for us to be reaching out to our delegation, both House and Senate, and what do you see as some of the best arguments for us to make to them?
I'm happy to chime in first. I think we've talked about we've talked about some of the reconciliation opportunities. There's the committee opportunity. So on May 6th, May 7th, all the members of the House Natural Resources Committee will have the opportunity to kind of vote for anywhere between 10 and hundreds of amendments. So making sure that that we're advocating to those individual members and urging them to vote a certain way on those amendments. That's one way to do it. It is a little complicated. I know we have a lot of folks from Montana here. Neither Montana representative is a member of that committee, so that does complicate things a little bit. But if you do live in Colorado or Utah or any of the other or have a member of Congress who serves on natural resources, then please do make your voice heard there. There may be, and there wasn't for the Inflation Reduction Act, but there may also be Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee consideration of legislative text. We've kind of heard that, you know, Chairman Lee might want to do a markup process as well, in which case there may be a committee process on the Senate side. And Senator Daines is a member of the Energy and Natural Resources Committee. So making your voice heard during a committee process on the Senate side would be another opportunity. And then the last big opportunity is Senate floor and the vote-a-rama process. That's a time when any senator can offer an amendment that the whole chamber has to vote on and can target any particular piece of the reconciliation bill. So you can really get a lot of people on the record and get good amendments out there too, like ones that strike specific provisions in the bill that we don't like. So those are kind of the three big inflection points. And again, I know we've talked about this a little bit, and it's really gotten a lot of oxygen just because of the threat. But public land sell-off is something that's really breaking through with a lot of people. You've seen, you know, the delegation from Montana talk about how they don't want to see that happen. And Representative Zinke's introduced the Public Lands and Public Hands bill. I think just continuing that pressure and making sure that those members of Congress are hearing from all of you about how important it is to not sell off public lands as part of this reconciliation bill is something that really can continue to break through.
And what I just would add to that is just also realizing that, like, when we get to moments of having committee votes and floor votes, like, our ability to put pressure on members on certain issues is really, or on the bill as a whole, is really, like, the earlier that they start hearing from constituents, the more effective it will be. And so really, as soon as the bill is introduced, I think just starting to kind of raise, you know, the drumbeat up to a new level is really important.
Right. And just to underscore, even though folks will be strictly instructed not to vote for any amendments that are put forward, there is that inflection point between when the House Natural Resources Committee is going to mark up the text you'll see in 2 weeks and when it gets to the House floor, where a lot of that stuff is going to get stripped away. And like I said, some of that's going to be stripped away for rules reasons, but a lot of it's going to be stripped out if it has been identified as a political pitfall. So it's really important in those couple weeks after you see that text to weigh in with these folks so they can go to their leadership and say, hey, if this comes to the floor with this provision in it, I'm going to have a hard time voting for it, and get it stripped out by the Rules Committee at that stage. So there's going to be a couple week period there in between when you see the text and when that opportunity arises. And that's a great time to make your voice heard.
I know we're reaching the end, and I think it's good to leave with a message that this is a really hard needle to thread. You know, there are actually probably like about 15 different holes in it or more, and so it is going to be challenging and you know, to pass. And so I think that a lot of us feel like the deck is stacked against us, and it is to some extent. But I think also there are challenging dynamics in the Congress, and I think that I just want to really encourage folks to feel like that we have an opportunity here, right? And that they're all, you know, there is still time to have impact and to shape what happens at the end of the day.
Okay, I think I think we covered all of the questions in the chat. You guys were very, very speedy and self-sufficient, which I appreciate. And I really appreciate all the thoughtful questions from the audience. You guys always bring up things that I didn't even think about. I guess I will need to rewatch this recording. This will be a substitute for a Schoolhouse Rock episode on budget reconciliation. But yeah, if there's anything else from our panelists, I wanted to give you a moment before we do some wrap up and housekeeping on that end of things.
Well, Aubrey, I would just say that, of course, you're welcome to rewatch this video as a Schoolhouse Rock substitute, but also you can just email me anytime. Wild Montana are a great partner. You are a great partner. I mean, that's a big part of the reason I know why Sarah and Justin and I are here today in the midst of all the DC chaos that are going on right now. So thank you for convening this. And yeah, we're here to help. So hit us up whenever you want to. And also just really heartening how good the questions are in the chat, I have to say, because I give these presentations especially when it's not in a room, when it's over these Zooms, and you can't see anyone's reactions. You can't see if they're falling asleep. So to get questions that are so good means at least, I don't know. It's some of it landed. I was just so relieved to see that. So thank you, everybody.
Yeah, Justin or Sarah, any last parting words?
Would just echo Kyle's thanks to Wild Montana and also impressed with the questions. I think that it also, to me, indicates that there's a lot of folks outside of DC who are watching this closely and ready to jump into the process. And so that's also really encouraging. And I think it's what we need in the moment. So thank you all.
Hear, hear. Thank you all for your questions, and thank you very much to Aubrey and Zach and Wild Montana for hosting us.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, NRDC work, TWS, you guys have been fantastic partners, thought partners, action partners. And so I really, really appreciate all the work that you always do with us and for us, and certainly being here today, yeah, in the midst of the chaos. It's pretty clear that protecting and celebrating our public lands and resources, it's a team sport. It takes a lot of teamwork, and that includes all of you on this call. You are integral, essential members of this team. So again, thank you for being here. Thanks for the thoughtful questions. I know it's a bit of a fire hydrant right now to keep track of everything that's going on. All of the calls to action from a range of interests and across a range of threats that I'm sure many of you care a lot about. And I really appreciate that you give your time and your thought and your energy to groups like Wild Montana, NRDC, TWS, and work. It really does mean a lot in these times. So keep an eye on your emails. That's always the quickest way that we're able to communicate with folks about these opportunities to take action. Sometimes we have short deadlines, and we know it can be a quick turnaround. If you ever have any questions about things, please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us. Again, you're part of the team, so don't ever hesitate. And with that, I think we'll sign off. We'll call it an afternoon. Thank you again to our panelists and everyone who joined us today.
Thanks. Next time, let's do this in Montana.
Yes, exactly. Thanks,
Sure.
everybody.
Thanks all.